This segment of WGCU's Local Untold Stories is underwritten by Hendry County Government, County Commission, LaBelle City Government, City Council, Burson Weathers Real Estate, and by the Benita Bay Group.
Long before highway and railroad systems spread veins of progress across the United States, American pioneers were seeking the promise of new lands along the country's great rivers. These flowing opportunities and fertile soil banks of the Hudson, Ohio, Missouri, and Mississippi rivers all attracted early settlers. In southwest Florida, similar settlements were forming along the winding Caloosahatchee River. Significant among them was a community of people that would become the city of LaBelle. Rivers also served as strategic sites for the new country's wars with the Native Americans. The United States Army erected several supply depots along the Caloosahatchee River, including Fort Thompson, which was established in 1838, east of modern-day LaBelle, Florida. Following the Seminole Wars in 1879, war veteran, politician, and prominent Florida cattleman, Captain Francis Asbury Hendry, purchased land in the Fort Thompson area and moved his cattle there.
He purchased thousands of acres and, of course, had a big, in fact, we called it the cattle king of South Florida.
Captain Hendry had run cattle on area land for years. He was one of the first to ship cattle from Punta Rassa to Cuba. Punta Rassa was once a bustling cattle shipping town at the mouth of the Caloosahatchee River. Hendry eventually built a large ranch-style wood-framed home on the Fort Thompson property. While he and his family resided at the home, Captain Hendry founded the community of LaBelle, naming it after his two daughters, Laura and Belle. At the time, area settlers were primarily cattle ranchers, farmers, fishermen, hunters, trappers, and sawmill operators. During the 1880s, settlements like Fort Thompson Park and LaBelle existed around abandoned forts along the Caloosahatchee River. Population growth along the river shore began in earnest with Hamilton Diston's dredging and drainage project in 1882. Diston was a northern industrialist who saw great development potential in area lands.
He purchased 2 million acres at 25 cents an acre. He brought some of his heavy equipment down here, and by dredging and straightening and deepening the river, it drained a lot of this off.
Diston also destroyed existing waterfalls near Fort Thompson Park.
Prior to that, none of the boats or the river traffic could go any further than Fort Thompson. But he opened it up to the lake.
The lake was Lake Okeechobee, near the center of the state. First, Diston excavated 11 miles of canal south of Lake Okeechobee toward Miami. He then dredged a navigable waterway from the lake north to the Kissimmee River and west to the Gulf of Mexico, which opened up the region to steamboat traffic. By the late 1880s, steamboats were carrying settlers and visitors up and down the Caloosahatchee. Among them was Edgar Everett Goodnow from Kansas. Goodnow spent his first years in Florida selling sandwiches at a stand in Fort Myers and occasionally visiting the LaBelle area, which at the time had around 300 residents.
He fell in love with it, and he says, "Someday I'm going to own this land up here." Of course, everybody laughed at him. You know, how much money will it take, or can you get, from selling sandwiches and Cokes or cold drinks, you know? But he saved and scrimped, and he bought the Captain Hendry property.
Starting around 1898, E. Goodnow began purchasing Captain Hendry's land in LaBelle, including the large ranch house at Fort Thompson. After selling to Goodnow, Hendry remained a part-time LaBelle resident. The captain eventually built a house in LaBelle proper, which still stands today. New Fort Thompson landowner E. Goodnow had big plans for the small town of LaBelle.
He remodeled the Captain Hendry house and added to it and turned it into a hotel.
In December of 1906, the elegant Thompson Park Hotel accepted its first guest. Goodnow began mailing brochures and literature to people across the country, luring them not only to his hotel, but also to the entire LaBelle area. He even offered land to potential homesteaders who agreed to stay.
That's really what began opening up the interior of Florida, because the east and west coast was already filling up with people coming on the railroads. So that's kind of how we got started. And he actually platted the city of LaBelle.
Goodnow laid out the streets of the growing town. He was also instrumental in the construction of the bridge across the Caloosahatchee River at LaBelle. The bridge connected what was then Lee and DeSoto counties. Throughout the early 1900s, many people were arriving in the area by steamboat, but the Caloosahatchee River's twists and turns were still difficult to navigate. Portions of the river also weren't very deep and often overflowed during the rainy season, flooding surrounding areas. Hence, dredging projects were ongoing during the early part of the century. In 1908, Captain M.E. Forey docked his dredge boat in LaBelle.
My earliest memories are hearing my mother and father say that my dad came up from the Fort Lauderdale area on the little dredge. The name of it was the Caloosahatchee, and his name was Melville Emery Forey. And there was about 8 or 9 young men that were on that dredge. On their way back to Fort Lauderdale, they stopped in LaBelle overnight, down at the bridge. All the young women went down to, everybody I guess in town went down to see the dredge.
The town made quite an impression on Captain Forey. He and a number of men from the Caloosahatchee dredge decided to come back to LaBelle to stay. Eventually, Forey even married Corinne Poole, one of the girls he had met on the banks of the river during his first visit. Since the area's earliest trading days, Seminole Indians visited trading posts near modern-day LaBelle to exchange hides for goods. Captain Forey, like others, maintained a close relationship with the Seminoles.
My father started buying the hides from them, alligator skins and coon hides and anything they brought in. My father bought that from the Indians.
During LaBelle's early days, trapping and hunting in the woods proved to be a cultural equalizer. William T. Maddox Jr.'s father was a hunter, cattleman, farmer, and lawman.
They all hunted, and not only just for the sake of hunting, but for food. I mean, they enjoyed it. That's where Dad first struck up his relationship with the Seminoles, I believe would be. He said he'd go down into the edge of the glades and come up to camp and bump into hunters down there, and I think they respected him for his hunting, and he respected them for their hunting, so they kind of made a good connection to start with.
South Florida's rugged interior provided a variety of game for Seminole and white hunters alike.
Deer, turkey, hogs. Dad was a notorious turkey hunter. Turkey and quail Dad could call with his mouth without any of these gadgets you have to use nowadays.
During the summer months, alligator hunters took to the swamps. Gators were often skinned on site and the meat was left behind. During the winter, traps or coon dogs were used to capture raccoons or opossum. The hunters brought hides to trading posts to exchange them for goods. In the early 1900s, LaBelle was still a small rural town made up primarily of ranchers, farmers, and sawmill operators. Nevertheless, Bridge Street, the town's main road, was lined with boarded sidewalks, and LaBelle's residents had access to electricity and ice, courtesy of E.E. Goodnow's plant at the Thompson Park Hotel.
They put in the line to LaBelle, and at 9 o'clock every night, the power went off. So 8:45, the lights would blink 2 or 3 times, and of course that was a signal, get what you want to do done.
Goodnow built a second hotel in LaBelle, the Everett, in 1910. Inventor Thomas Edison, auto manufacturer Henry Ford, and tire magnate Harvey Firestone were frequent guests. During the town's early years, development remained close to the banks of the Caloosahatchee River.
All the businesses were from about 4 blocks from the river down toward the river. Saturdays particularly, the grocery stores, all the stores stayed open till about 10 o'clock. So everybody came to town and visited. The kids played up and down the streets, clear to the river and back.
For many years, LaBelle residents depended on the river as their primary connection to the outside world. In 1914, Captain Alva Burke began making a daily boat run from LaBelle to Fort Myers.
He took the mail from here to Fort Myers, and he would take passengers on his boat and stopped in Alva and along the way where people lived. And that was our only communication, was by the river.
Over the years, informal classes for school children had taken place at several locations, including at Captain Hendry's Fort Thompson home. But it wasn't until 1915 that construction began on LaBelle's first public school.
We had this beautiful old red brick building with the big white columns and pillars on the front of it. I went to that one, and that was just grades 1 through 6. They built another, what we called the high school, in I think it was 1919, and that was the other 6 grades.
Like school children elsewhere, LaBelle students studied basic subjects such as math, social studies, and world history. They also learned about a subject that played an important part in the town's way of life: agriculture.
Being in a rural county like we were, ag was a pretty important subject for a lot of the boys because of their livelihood. The ag program taught them to work on the farm and do things that they would do for a livelihood.
Sawmills were another integral part of LaBelle's development. Sawmill operators commonly lived in homes alongside their workplace. Some mills were stationary, while others were portable and could be relocated when a portion of the woods was logged out. In the beginning, oxen or mules were used to haul logs away. Later, the railroads, great consumers of timber, eagerly joined in the effort. The Roaring Twenties presented LaBellians with both great triumph and tragedy. In 1923, civic-minded residents demanded a county separate from Lee.
They just decided if we had our own county, we could do more for the people here. My father and these 4 other guys went to Fort Myers and asked to have part of Lee County turned into Hendry County, and that's the way we got Hendry County.
LaBelle was designated as the Hendry County seat in 1923, and dredge operator M.E. Forey became the chairman of the first board of Hendry County Commissioners. The board's first order of business was to build the present courthouse. Forey and others mortgaged their businesses to bring the building to LaBelle. By the mid-1920s, LaBelle had grown to about 500 residents, and Henry Ford was investing in large amounts of area land. For a short time, he, Edison, and Firestone conducted agricultural experiments on Ford's property. The 3 men were looking for a reliable source of rubber to be used in Firestone tires that would end up on Ford's cars.
Edison being an inventor, they planted some rubber plant. Well, they planted goldenrod up at Fort Thompson in a parcel there. And that didn't pan out, or Edison couldn't make rubber out of goldenrod sap. So they planted 1 acre, 2 acres or so of rubber trees. And he was to try to obtain and make rubber from those rubber trees. Well, that didn't really pan out too well either.
Another notable name in American history left its mark on LaBelle in 1926. During this time, Sears and Roebuck Incorporated was selling pre-manufactured homes across the country. These homes required a great deal of lumber, some of which came from the area around LaBelle.
Sears was a little community down maybe 9 or 10 miles south of LaBelle, and then probably 4 miles or so back east. And Mrs. Sears of Sears and Roebuck brought her sawmill down here and set it up.
Unfortunately, the company encountered some setbacks.
The second year that it was there, one of our big storms came through and messed up some of the machinery. So she replenished that and got it going again.
However, between the 1926 and 1928 hurricanes and the area's hard pine trees, which damaged machinery, the sawmill and the surrounding community didn't survive. Some of the manufactured Sears homes, however, did.
There's several places in town that are still inhabited by people in Sears houses.
The devastating 1926 and 28 hurricanes and their subsequent flooding didn't just have a negative impact on the Sears sawmill operation, they also were extremely hard on the folks in LaBelle, but they clung together as a community.
It was devastating for the grown people, that the children just thought it was fun because we practically lived in the water when it was flooding. And down at our place there, I've seen the water come clear up into the building underneath the tables. So that must have been 3 or 4 feet high. The water would stay up 2 or 3 weeks, and it was really messy, of course, but the people coped with it.
Another tragedy occurred in LaBelle in 1926, but this one was man-made. While LaBelle has a long history as a friendly, welcoming community, it wasn't immune to the racial tensions between blacks and whites prevalent across America at the time. In LaBelle, what began as a misunderstanding ended in tragedy.
I understand the woman was not quite all there. She wasn't really a real sociable person. She was ironing one day, so the house and the doors were open while she was ironing, trying to keep cool. So she heard somebody at her back door, and she went to the back door, and not having seen a black man before, it scared her to death. She ran out the front door screaming. The people who stopped thought she was trying to say the man had tried to rape her, which apparently was not the case. He was wanting a drink of water. Well, that was a terrible misunderstanding. So the fellow that stopped and had talked to her came back to town, and they were trying to go out. In fact, he got kind of a posse together and tried to go out and hunt the man down. Well, in the meantime, the man was frantically trying to save his own life.
Sadly, Joseph Patterson didn't escape, and when the mob caught him, they beat and tortured him to death.
They strung up what was left of him in a pine tree and just left him there. They did bring it to trial. My father-in-law, Judge Ryder, was the defense attorney for some of the family, and he was called all kinds of names, had to leave town for several weeks.
27 people were prosecuted for Patterson's death, but individual guilt couldn't be established, and no one was convicted.
It is a bad thing. I don't think that's a reflection on our community then or now.
The United States both suffered social turmoil and enjoyed economic prosperity during the 20s. Some of that prosperity can be attributed to the continued expansion of the railroads. By 1926, railways lined Florida's coastlines, and they continued to expand deeper into the state's interior. It was during this time that the Seaboard Coastline Railroad built a line from Fort Myers to LaBelle, providing another reliable method of transportation to and from the small river town. A couple of years later, in 1928, tragedy struck again. Not only did that year's devastating hurricane sweep across the region, but a fire destroyed nearly half the town as well.
Across the street from us was a little 2-story hotel, and the old story is that it was set on fire. You know, it was an arson for insurance purposes.
The fire spread rapidly between the town's dry pine buildings, and it took years to rebuild Bridge Street. Further changes to the area occurred during the 20s and 30s, when fever-carrying ticks threatened the livestock. To protect the cattle, the government funded a tick elimination campaign. Ranchers were required to dip their cattle in a vat of chemical solution every 14 days to eliminate the ticks. In order to differentiate which animals had been dipped and which hadn't, the cowmen built fences to keep the animals separate, and with that, the era of open cattle range came to an end, giving way to fenced-in pastures. While fences now divided Florida's open prairie, the railroad system continued to connect the nation. In the process, the expanding railroads utilized an incredible amount of lumber.
In the United States, in about 1930, they used 2.3 billion feet of lumber a year. And that was used for cross ties to go under the rails. It was lumber to provide for sidings and bridges, things of that nature, and also for fuel.
While most Americans suffered from the effects of the Great Depression, new employment opportunities provided the people of LaBelle some relief. Many of the town's residents went to work for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, working on flood control projects along the Caloosahatchee River and Lake Okeechobee. New businesses also managed to take root in LaBelle in the late 1920s and early 30s.
My grandparents settled in LaBelle in 1927, and they came here to find employment, but that's during the Depression, so they wound up in the dry cleaning business, and that was the business they established 1929.
In 1933, Flora and Ella's Restaurant, an area landmark, was born. Throughout the years, it has remained famous for its home-cooked cracker food and delicious pies. With time, as more and more businesses were established and LaBelle kept developing, larger companies came to the area as well.
The roots of Alico lie in the words Atlantic Land Improvement Company. Atlantic Land Improvement Company was a part of the Atlantic Coastline Railroad. We have a long association with railroads. LaBelle is close to the center of the location of lands that the Atlantic Land Improvement Company owned. And so their first office was a temporary office in the Hendry County Courthouse in 1948. And it wasn't long till they bought the original train station in LaBelle from the Seaboard Coastline Railroad.
As its operations grew, the company helped meet LaBelle's infrastructure needs by providing some of the area's first fire prevention services.
Alico entered into an agreement with the state of Florida, the Division of Forestry, in which they agreed to help by providing 2 sites to construct both a house and a tower, a lookout tower, to provide fire prevention services to this area. They were the first towers constructed south of the Caloosahatchee River.
The agribusiness has a history of innovation.
I believe it was in about 1950 that they dedicated 70,000 acres to be a tree farm, and it was one of the largest tree farms ever been dedicated.
Alico was also instrumental in carving out area canals with the help of 3 of LaBelle's founding families, the Hilliards, the Barons, and the Hendrys.
Together they constructed what's now known as Canal C1, C2, and C3, which utilize water from the Caloosahatchee River, and we utilize water for irrigating the sugar cane and the citrus, and then we recharge it also. We have recharge capability too. They had this vision that if they could get water, they could control water, both irrigation purposes and also for drainage purposes. They could turn the land that's otherwise very flat and therefore poorly drained into highly productive land.
Much of that land was dedicated to growing citrus, which was becoming big business for Alico and all of Hendry County. Repeated freezes in North and Central Florida had driven the citrus industry south. LaBelle eventually came to call itself the citrus capital of Florida. Citrus groves still surround the small town.
Early on, all the citrus trees were just planted on high ground, real high ground. Well, over the years, we've learned how to ditch and put beds up, which allowed the, number one, you to lower the water table, the ditches did, and by throwing beds up, that allowed us to raise the height of the tree about 3 feet over the surrounding land, and consequently, you raise the root level up 3 feet above the underlying water levels.
Even today, agribusiness remains central to LaBelle's economy.
It's been the backbone of our economy for a long, long time, and still is. It's changing, and we can see the change. We can see it with the development coming. The coast are full. But cattle is still strong, and so is sugarcane and citrus.
Florida is the #1 producer of cattle east of the Mississippi River. We're 17th in the nation with number of cattle.
LaBelle recognizes its agricultural heritage. Since 1967, the town has welcomed visitors to its annual Swamp Cabbage Festival. Pioneers ate swamp cabbage, harvested from the heart of the state tree, the sable palm. The festival, held in February, has grown substantially over the years. In 2005, nearly 30,000 people flooded the town for a parade, food, and festivities at Barron Park, along the banks of the Caloosahatchee River.
I was born in a small town, and I live in a small town.
The LaBelle JCs established the event to honor pioneer families.
We decided that it'd be nice to do a few honors, so how about having a pioneer family and a grand marshal? So they took that right up. But since I was the one to open my mouth, they said, well, how about your mom? Well, Mom, who was Corinne Pufori, was born here in 1891, so she was legal to be that. So after that, we just have a pioneer family every year.
In the river town of LaBelle, maintaining a viable connection with the past seems as important to residents as dealing with progress. Change is inevitable, but some view it with mixed emotions.
Hometown atmosphere is not going to be the same, we realize. I know that, and that's what I'm going to miss.
By 2005, the greater LaBelle area had grown to around 12,000 residents, and like the rest of Florida, more growth is sure to follow. Nevertheless, the small town on the banks of the Caloosahatchee River remains a slice of old Florida.
To order a video of this program, call 1-888-824-0030 or visit our website at WGCU.org, and please refer to the program number on your screen.